Welcome to the Disrupt Your Career podcast, brought to you by Claire Harbour
and Antoine Tirard. We're passionate about helping everyone find fulfillment in their work life.
We believe that big, messy, uncharted career changes are inevitable, and it's up to you to decide.
Will you take control and disrupt, or allow yourself to be disrupted?
We wrote the book about it, and now we share here our conversations with other thinkers in this crucial area.
Settle down and get ready to listen to this dose of wisdom.
So this time on this episode of the Disrupt Your Career podcast, I'm really delighted to be welcoming Amanda Goodall. She's a professor of leadership at the Business School in London. She publishes in academic journals and all kinds of other non-technical practitioner publications. And she had a particularly unusual start to her career compared with most of our guests, but we'll come back to that. In the meantime, Amanda, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's get going. Let's start with our usual beginning question, which is your career journey. You've been through several pivots and challenges in your career, starting out as a catwalk model at 16, then going into a rural medical center in India, and followed by a decade of fundraising. And finally into academia, where you have been studying the effects of expertise on leadership. Please share with us how this extraordinary career unfolded. Usually ask, by the way, was it by design or serendipity? But I'm not really sensing I need to ask that this time. So take me through the moments of pride and achievements and the sorts of challenges you've encountered along the way.
It usually starts off through serendipity, and then like a kind of horse that's slightly out of control, one eventually grabs the reins and then steers it. So I guess that's what happened to me. I was a military brat, as we say. So my father was in the Air Force and we traveled around a lot. He was a pilot. So we moved around a lot and we lived in the United States and various other places. And I wasn't great at school, put it that way. I loved the traveling around, so I would never have wanted that. And some military brats get sent off to boarding school, and they knew I would run away immediately. So they never even tried. But I wasn't great at school, didn't get on at all well, didn't concentrate, probably would have been diagnosed with something or other today. But then I wasn't. I'm possibly quite pleased I wasn't, maybe, I don't know. But anyway, school and I parted at 16 and it was good for me. So I left the last place my parents lived and went to London very early on just to get to London, which I loved. And then, just started modeling. Just wasn't a particularly brilliant model, just kind of a working girl, not of the other kind, just of that model. It was great. I wanted to leave Britain a lot at that time. And so I lived in Milan very early on, lived in Hong Kong, various other places. So it was a great opportunity, actually, I have to say. And it wasn't necessarily the right career for me, but I did it for 7-8 years and that was great. And then politics had always been a big thing for me. I'd always been very motivated by politics, developmental politics, particularly. Whenever I could, I'd become a little bit bored of modeling. And I went to India, in fact, and lived in a small development project in Andhra Pradesh in India. Really learn about the politics of development. I paid my way. I wasn't there helping the poor or anything pretty awful like that. So I paid my way and lived on this small development project. And the guy who was Prakash who ran the project was my first sort of time I'd become, apart from the people I'd worked with in the fashion industry, first time I was really impressed with someone in a leadership role, because he was an extraordinary man. He is an extraordinary man, great humility, emotional intelligence, etc. long before that term was ever really very common. Worked out there for a year, did quite a lot of traveling around as well in India, but basically stayed in that one place in an old operating theatre, and then came back to the UK, did a bit more modelling just to make a bit more money. And then I joined, started working for different organizations, international organizations. So I worked with the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign. At the time, Americans were at war with El Salvador, Chile, Nicaragua, etc. The Contra War, as it was called. So I was part of the opposition in Britain, campaigning for that. And I worked with lots of different organizations at the time, CND, all sorts of various organizations as a consultant. And then I realized that the revolution wasn't about to come anytime soon. And so it wasn't that I got disillusioned, but I started prison visiting, kind of focused from the mass change down to the individual. I thought maybe I should do law, or you could change the individual if you can't change the world. I guess a lot of people go through this at that kind of age. So I thought maybe it's time to do a degree to further my education, to sort of understand the world in a more complex way rather than through the rather simplistic way sometimes that you do when you're young, the kind of the good, the bad. And life is always much more complicated. So I started a degree in law, in fact, and then I realized that that level of detail wasn't for me. So I shifted to LSE and did social policy. And I was 33 at the time, actually. So I was a late starter. I had a good 2 decades gap. And then I really enjoyed it. I really got into the learning, actually, and that really gripped me, I have to say. It was amazing. What was great was having all that experience behind me, and then going into education at that age. I went in at 33, as I said, and it kind of stuck to the experiences that what I'd seen in the world. The education kind of made more sense to me somehow. Not saying that it wouldn't have made sense at the time if I'd gone on from school, because I don't know, I didn't do it. So I'm an empiricist, so I can't say that causality necessarily goes that way, but it did make sense. I've been wanting to change the world, thinking about, life in that kind of black and white way. And then education shows you that actually it is more complicated, and you learn about it in a much deeper way. And you also learn the power of evidence. That's what really got me into thinking about evidence, about data. Yeah, you really need to understand evidence. It's a much, much more complicated. And also the great thing about education at university in particular is you learn objectivity. You learn that you have to be objective. Whereas when you're younger, you're much more subjective, I would say. Before it, I would have said I was much more black and white. After I did my degree, I don't know whether my friends would agree with that, but I feel I became more objective anyway. So
I'm fascinated to get you to think about what the most important lessons you learnt were in those early years of career. That, I'm thinking maybe it's the Indian operating theatre guy, maybe it's somebody else, but which of these leaders was teaching you what kind of things, and what has stood with you for the most significant part of the rest of your life?
The person who I worked with in India, Prakash, had incredible integrity. There was another person who we worked with out there called Goodall, who was a playwright, who we then brought over to Britain, myself and 2 friends, and he did tours and stuff. And again, extraordinary, incredibly intelligent, but they had extraordinary integrity and modesty. And I think those are the things that, to me, about leadership, apart from the expertise side of things, being able to put yourself into someone else's shoes and just kind of being modest, the modesty, integrity. I mean, I think that was incredible. Having witnessed that from people at an early age made a big impression on me. Show-offs, names droppers, that kind of stuff. I was never turned on to them.
And you'd probably have met a few of them in the fashion industry.
I have met them.
Oh, yeah. I've been there too. Yes, indeed. So wonderful. Good lessons of proper leadership then. Real, true leadership of integrity and authenticity. Beautiful. So let's talk about the big transition that you made from those early career years, which were somewhat serendipitous, increasingly focused, but nevertheless, you then made this massive disruptive shift into academia. Now, we love these kinds of big changes. That's what we are most passionate about in our work, but it's a huge challenge. How did you do it, and what was it like?
So after I'd done my degree at LSE, I did quite well at it, which was quite a surprise to me. And it has to be said. And I was going to do a PhD straight away, but I'd run out of money because I was a mature student and I had to apply for it. But at that point I was broke. So I started working with the then head of LSE, a guy called Anthony Giddens, who is a sociologist, a very highly cited, very famous. He's now in the House of Lords. He's very active in the House of Lords. And I started working with him. So that was interesting because it was sort of about the learning, and then going into working with him as this kind of apparatchik, sort of right hand, getting various initiatives off the ground, etc. So that was also interesting for me, working very close proximity with a leader. And I learned things from him as well about sort of keeping calm, keeping balanced, because I have got a temper on me and sometimes I would lose it. And he'd sort of, he'd kind of question it in a very balanced way, actually. It was good. It was really good. Then I had an opportunity to go to Chicago to work for at the start of an online university. So this was in 2000, right? So it was so ahead of its time. It was set up by University of Chicago professors who invested in it, and it had backing from LSE, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, etc. And I was to be the liaison for the other universities. Anyway, that was also interesting because considering there was a few, I don't know how many business professors there were involved, but there was certainly, they threw so much money at it. They managed to galvanize and raise so much money, but they spent so much money. That was the first time I kind of really saw status in action there. So suddenly there was like 150 vice presidents and all this kind of stuff. Unfortunately, it went, as we say in English, tits up. It went down. It was around the time of the dot bombs, so that was natural. But I do think that they made mistakes. I think they spent so much money on beautiful coffee machines and all this kind of stuff. They just ran before they could walk. And of course, the world at that stage wasn't ready for online education, actually. It really took COVID to get us doing this kind of stuff online in a way that we hadn't done before. Anyway, that went down. I then jumped back from UNext into Warwick University, where I had a job with another vice chancellor. And he was actually an American from Johns Hopkins previously. And that's where I really noticed the difference between him and Tony Giddens. He had given up his research very early on in his career and gone into the administration, as they used to call it. So he'd become a leader quite early on. Whereas Tony Giddens kept doing research all the time, and he was obsessed about his research. And that's where I noticed which we'll talk about in a minute, no doubt, that's where the hypotheses came for the whole research. So at that point was when I decided I really want to look at this intellectually. I always wanted to do my PhD. And so this was the time now. And that was the hypothesis. Should universities be led by top scholars or very good managers? And I did it at Warwick Business School. And that's where I stepped into academe, basically. And by this time, I'm in my 40s. So I'm not, again, I went into that late. But again, what was great about that was that I was able to bring in a real life observation into, and I work with quite a few executive PhDs at Bayes now. And it's great because they bring their real life observations into the classroom. Yep. And they're testing hypotheses that they have observed, or they're testing, or they're asking questions that they've been asking in the real world. And it's fascinating. So they're not just kind of grabbing onto the coat strings of some professor and emulating or copying or whatever, following in their footsteps, which is one way to do it. I'm not saying that that's not a good way to do it. And you have to do it if you're a mathematician, if you're a scientist, that's what you probably have to do. But for social scientists, it's slightly different. And again, not for everyone. But for me, it was fantastic because I've observed these behavior differences. So I could then go into the classroom and test the hypotheses. And that's what I did.
So that brilliant start and taking inspiration from real life sounds like a wonderful way to start that part of your career. Let's jump right forward to almost the present time and your book, Credible. What exactly was your motivation to write it? Clearly, it was inspired by those early observations, but a lot more evidence and everything else. What need are you trying to address with the book? And what was your process for writing it?
I did my PhD, and I found in that PhD that the best universities in the world are more likely to be led by top scholars rather than average scholars or non-scholars. And I found that in longitudinal data. So my PhD was published by Princeton University Press in 2009. And very soon after that, I was in the States for a visit, and I got approached by an agent in Boston, actually, who wanted me to write a book with a similar kind of message for different work environments. And this was in 2009. And I said to him, look, I've only replicated this in a very small number of settings right now. And there were a few other settings in the book. But I said, I really want to do this book, but I need to get more data. I need to know. I mean, I don't know whether you've ever found this, but there's hundreds of books. There's over 100,000 papers with the word leadership in it. But if you stopped a random person in the street and just said, what do you know to be true about leadership? What generalizable fact do you know to be true about leadership? I'm not sure what they would say. They might say, oh, we want to avoid narcissistic idiots. And then I'd have to look at the world and go, well, that didn't go well, did it? Who's our leadership at the moment in many countries? But exactly those people. It's like we haven't even learned that. What other generalizable fact have we learned about leadership through all of these books? I mean, maybe you can tell me, because you may have interviewed more people who've written about leadership than I have.
I'm as at a loss as you are, frustrated by the fact daily, not only at our sort of inability to describe it adequately, but to create great leaders. I mean, whether it's politics or business, I'm constantly disappointed.
It was that reason, but it was more about the kind of generalizability for us to be able to know there is something true that doesn't explain everything about leadership. My research doesn't explain everything about leadership, of course, but I can honestly say now, after, from 2003, when I started the PhD to today, 20 years, I can say that I genuinely believe this pattern is one that's generalizable across all organizations. And there'll be, there's lots of other variables involved, but I can be sure about that. So that was why the passage of the book was really, I want to keep replicating this in as many settings as I can. And then eventually I would love to write this book when I feel really confident. And also I understand there's a term in econometrics called the transfer mechanism. So how does an expert affect or influence change? Through which mechanisms does that happen? So I wanted to understand not everything about those. I don't understand everything about those, but I understand quite a lot about those now. So that's the passage of the book. And why I wrote this book is that I'm a great believer, maybe because of the way that I came through into academe. I think we have to communicate at every single level. So I do quite a lot of media stuff. When they invite me, I will always say yes for everything, because I think that's, academe produces research, but it's not for other researchers exclusively. It has to be, we have to get it out there, especially in applied schools like business schools. I think that's really important. Is that stuff for the business world? If so, it's got to get out there. It's no good just publishing where 3 people read it. So that was why I felt Credible had to be a book that was written in plain English, and could be understood, and was one that, hopefully might go into the world. I actually also do feel that the world needs to think again about expertise. I mean, we are on the edge of another extinction potentially. New York's just been smothered by smoke from Canada and many other cities. And if there was ever a time that we had to really start listening to experts, I think that's now also. So that was another motivation.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a wonderful connection to make, even though a very sad and tragic one. Okay, now within the book, there are all kinds of rather incredible, in the more metaphoric sense, words, stories, and multiple pieces of advice and guidance, notably around the importance of leaders coming from that organization's sector or field, and the disasters that can happen if this is not the case, and the current trend of devaluation of expertise versus general management. And you cover sectors that are as diverse as medicine, sport, and business. But if you were to boil down the main ideas and themes of the book, what would these be? Again, in layman's terms, please.
The main arguments, I suppose, that are in the book are that we've swung the pendulum way too far down the managerial generalist route. We have to bring it back much more so that we think about expertise, experience, and we really need to go back to thinking about, I do say go back because this is how it used to be, to go back to having leaders and line managers who really understand the core business of organizations, both at the top and through the organization. If you have them at the top, you are more likely to get them through the organization. And this is all around the core business. Now, naturally, you need a marketing person, you need a finance person, you need HR, you need all of these other parts to an organization. And they must also be experts, but they must not run the show. They must not be in the top leadership positions, in my view. And the organizational strategy shouldn't be focused exclusively around marketing or HR or finance. And we've seen many companies led by finance people. As an example I use in the book was Boeing. When Boeing was taken over by another company, accountants ran the show far more than engineers. And that is a lot about what happened to these terrible Boeing crashes with Max and also with the Dreamliners, the failures of the Dreamliners at first. So that would be the succinct message, is we need to bring expertise back into the center of our recruitment. And importantly, promotion. We need to promote much more, in my view, from within the organization, and just stop thinking that there's always shinier toys outside.
I want to come straight to another question, which is terribly important and is directly related to the work that we do. One of the fundamentals of our work has been to preach for recruiters to consider seriously those who don't necessarily have experience in a particular business or sector. And the reasoning is being, that the skills and mindsets that are derived from multiple transitions also bring value and can, on occasion, trump the value derived from consistent roles in the same area. Now, we hear your statistics and arguments. We're not going to dispute them at all. The arguments for there being more expert CEOs definitely make sense, particularly in the context that you've situated them. But I guess in the end, the question is, do organizations need a mix of both experts and flexible generalists? And what about that notion that flexibility of learning, approach, culture, and context is important and valuable at lower levels? And is this in the end a question of levels? I.e., are experts crucial in the C-suite, but generalists are okay elsewhere?
Where experts are most important is in any leadership position. So I've got numerous stories, but I couldn't even get into the book, of people who were line managed by people who really didn't understand what they were doing, whether it was doctors being line managed by nurses. Someone told me something the other day, an electrician said that the company brought in someone who didn't understand electricians at all, whatever it is. Even someone from EE phone company said, her line manager has got to be someone who understands the way that she works. So I think line managers, in many respects, line managers are the most important position because all of us are directly affected by our line manager. It affects our promotion, our development, our mentoring. And that's a big thing about this. If you've got a line manager who is a real expert, if you were just thinking about a field, if you were a lawyer and you had a line manager who was an outstanding lawyer, someone you can look up to, who's a mentor, who can help you learn in advance. And that doesn't matter whether you're working for EE, whatever your job you're in, you want someone who can help you progress in the organization. Now, if your line manager doesn't understand what you do, doesn't understand really the organization or the core business, then they can't help you progress in your career. It's just not possible. So I think that's very, very important. Now, it's not to say that everyone's got to be core business experts, but I would say probably that they would be experts in other parts. So if they've been running particular administrative support structures or whatever it is, it would be important that they know what to do. For example, I know a head of HR came into a university. She'd never worked in university. You'd think that was a kind of generic skill. It didn't work out at all well. She just didn't understand the setup in universities at all. It's not to say that I'm against generalists as such, because obviously there are generalists who support experts, and that interaction between the two is extremely important. And it's not to say that people coming in with different experiences isn't important also. I would say that if anyone is coming into a sector where they really don't know anything about it, the most important thing is, number one, to learn about it as quickly as possible. And also for their opinion always to be validated, supported by someone who is an expert. So if they had too much power and were managing people, but they didn't really understand that question, and I guess that's a question for us all, is you can't have empathy. We talk about the need for empathy. I can't really have empathy for you if I don't understand exactly what you do. How can I be empathic? How can I help you and really put myself in your shoes if I don't know what the hell shoes you're standing in? And that's part of the issue, really, is that how can someone who's working, working in a team, again, that you're going to bring all sorts of different players together. And as long as the team leader is the core business expert there, or at least, someone's always a boss in a team, even though we rely on teams. You might not like the idea of saying that. We always go, teams, schmeams. But actually, there's always someone who is slightly more senior in a team. Because as we all know, if everything's done by balanced committee, it can be quite challenging sometimes. But it's not to say that I don't think people who don't have any knowledge of something should never go into that field. But I do think they need to do a lot of learning. In terms of flexibility, the last chapter that I talk about in the book is all about what does an expert friendly organization look like? What does Expertopia look like? And flexibility is absolutely number one in there. That's one of the key things I outlined. So we have to be flexible. We have to have low bureaucracy and all that kind of stuff. And we can talk about that more later if you want. But I absolutely think flexibility is important. I don't think bringing someone who doesn't know the industry is necessarily a signal of flexibility, but it's a signal of open-mindedness. And we always need to have our opinions from people outside. I guess what we've always heard in the past is that we're bringing someone in because they've done it from the outside and they can bring their opinions with them. Well, what you're saying that a doctor or a telephone engineer is incapable of hearing those opinions and bringing them in themselves and adapting them. I'm doing a bit of research just now with an American company that looks at health tech organizations. And we have data on about 600 health tech companies in America. And there's been an assumption that to set up a health tech company, you just need someone who's really good at tech. And doctors are kind of brought in to sort of show their shiny faces, and then they're not really given much power. So we're looking at this. We have a strong already signals showing that health tech companies need the doctors very close to the tech, and just having a techie isn't going to make much sense. So that's kind of an example of this, but that's an empirical question and we're looking at it. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Oh, it does. It absolutely does. Thank you. What I'm also hearing is a certain amount of degrees within the range of different types of industries that might be where it might be more crucial or less for expert leaders. How do you know which industries will be better off with an expert leader, and where do you draw the line?
I wouldn't agree with you there. So I think people, when I use the word experts and expertise, they automatically, and it's my fault, I'm going to have to change the dialogue, automatically think of, because I've done quite a lot of stuff in medicine or law, and I should change the tune really, because I'm talking about anything. I'm talking about painters. I'm talking about electricians. I'm talking about people in care homes, carers. I'm talking about everyone. In fact, there's a story in the book about a head nurse, a nurse who was the CEO of a care home. I'm talking across industry. And why am I confident about that? Because there's a data set. Denmark's quite a progressive country, and it collects what we call administrative data on every single company in the whole country, from small to large. So we've got a study where we look at this question across all companies in Denmark, and we look at them across 18 years. So it's longitudinal data as well. And we find a very, very strong pattern that companies that are led by the person who started them or by industry experts outperform those that aren't. And that's right across the whole of the country. So I don't think there is necessarily
much of a degree. Yeah,
I really don't think there is. Now, it doesn't mean that obviously there's some areas that you do need deep expertise in, maybe more than others, but you think that about health tech, right? You think that, my goodness, they're developing a technique that might go in someone's body. Surely that company is going to be run by a doctor. But no, you think hospitals might be run by doctors, in the UK, because hell, doctors think about patients first. They must know about this, but no, they're not. Virtually none are run by doctors in the UK. So, but I am talking across all spectrums, and it's true. I should move away from just talking about lawyers and doctors. I really believe it's everyone. Now, just to say, Claire, it's, I'm looking at statistical patterns in large data sets. It doesn't mean that there aren't outliers. It doesn't mean that there's examples where it could be different. It doesn't mean that there's not areas that are slightly grayer because the company's diversified and you can't pinpoint exactly who that expert is. So I'm not disagreeing that there are going to be grey areas and outliers. I hope that answers the question.
Definitely. Absolutely. Now, in an FT article that you published last year, you wrote something rather extraordinary. I love it. To raise the number of women, Black and minority ethnic people in leadership positions, radical change is needed. I am proposing the use of random selection from a pre-chosen pool of candidates for promotion into middle management. Tell us more about this amazingly provocative idea, and has any company actually tried it?
Well, this is the work really comes from my co-author on that particular study called Margit Osterloh. They've been looking at random selection for years. Her and her husband, Bruno, have been looking at random selection as a tool for a long, long time. So we thought, would it be interesting to try and use it? Because one of the problems you get with around diversity is confidence, people holding back, not throwing their hat into the ring because they're worried about rejection, and that would have an even more adverse effect on their confidence. So for many reasons, people don't throw their hat in the ring because they just presume that it's not going to go their way. And of course, history can show that, discrimination has been so strong, et cetera, et cetera. So people are very nervous about random selection. There's a group of academics who love random selection, and it is used. Of course, it's used for, in a way, one of the most important systems in the world. It's used for jury. Juries are picked randomly, right? And that's a matter of life and death, actually, or at least in America, but it's certainly a big decision, actually. So they are used in certain places, but in many areas, people are just too nervous about it. And in some ways, we've become so risk averse in everything we do that I think the chances of using it are unlikely. But the idea was that, and the evidence for this is quite strong. There's quite a few people who've got random selection studies out there where they show that the quality of the person selected is as good or better than doing it in other ways. And the idea was that you have a certain standard of person that is selected to go into the pool. So you're not just picking anyone randomly. It's a selective randomization, that these individuals are selected because they have the basic criteria. But then what you do is you randomly choose the person who's going to get the job. And the idea being that it's a clean process. People notoriously on hiring panels make the wrong decisions. Part of the reason of discrimination is that we're so prone to homophily. If you know what homophily is, like for like selection. And this is a way of protecting against that. So, I think it got a few, you never read the comments written by people when you write a journalistic article, because they're often not going to be very generous. It got some interesting comments, but unfortunately, even though I think random selection is a fantastic tool, I don't think it's going to go anywhere, because I think people are way too risk averse to do that. Even though they spend money every week on lotteries and all this kind of thing.
Oh, but that's completely random, different, sad, but different mentality. So let's think about how an early career professional might apply some of your thinking and ideas. What advice would you have for an early career professional who's looking to start out, and to what extent should each of them be crafting themselves as experts?
Spotting and developing experts. There's 2 chapters in there that myself and 3 other people who've contributed to focus on quite a lot. And this is something that I had a conversation about with a friend the other day about going to university. So going to university is a kind of general undergraduate degree is a start. And you sometimes hear people saying, but what's the point? Why don't we just go straight and do an apprenticeship or something? And I do think university is really, really important. But I also think that even when you've gone to university, even if you focused in a particular field in university, I think the most important thing, or that it's a generalist degree, the most important thing is finding that industry, finding that field, that business, that challenge that you really find interesting and that you think is going to grab you for a few years. Now, people do change jobs a lot more. There's a lot more fluidity in the marketplace, of course. People move around a hell of a lot more. But if you really want to succeed in anything, I would say tenacity and focus is so important. So even if you've got generalist things and you may start off somewhere and you may think, oh, this is really dull, I still think get to know that field, that industry, that company, and then think about finding the right boss who's going to develop you, who's going to help you progress. But focus early on, I think, is important. And tenacity, I think, is really, really important. I think one of the issues you've got in the world at the moment is a kind of, we've sort of broken into an individuality, which in some ways is great because it celebrates diversity. In some ways, I think it's gone a bit too far. And partly because I think if we're going to save the planet, we need to think about the collective, not just about our individual voices. But second, I think one of the things that I love in an organization is when I feel I'm a part of that organization, when I feel kind of, an empathy for the organization, and I feel that they care about me. And you can only have that when you invest in that organization and when you invest, in what they're doing. So you do have to find somewhere where they believe in you and you believe in them. And I would say, not only do you have to become an expert, I would say look for an organization where there's not just some random person that switches every 3 years, but where there really is someone who's committed to it. There's a company in the United States, I've just forgotten its name. Basically it produces electrical equipment and has done for 100 years. And it's extraordinary. It's had something like 4 CEOs, each one of them doing around 20 years. So maybe it's 5 if it's 100, but it's had so few CEOs and they've all worked their way up and been in the company for a long time. And just to say, actually, on that point, I'm not a great fan of the big 4 management consultancies. Some I dislike more than others, it has to be said. However, you will never progress in Deloitte, McKinsey, PwC, Boston Consulting, any of them, unless you work your way up. I mean, if you look at any of the heads of these organizations, they have been there 30 years. Yep. Now, they don't preach what they practice. That's what's interesting. They think they can swan into other organizations and tell them what to do. And yet they would never, ever, ever, you will never see, I don't know, someone from Ford suddenly becoming the head of McKinsey. It's not going to happen.
No.
Now, why aren't they preaching that? But that's another story. But I would say, come in, find the right organization, find organizations that you feel an emotional attachment to and that you love what they're doing. And that helps you. That adds a stickiness that helps you really connect to them and become an expert in them.
Wonderful. Thank you. What makes an organization an expert-friendly one? You've alluded to Expertopia, which I think is a wonderful word. What does it actually look like?
An organization that is one that has a number of factors that all work alongside each other. So, for example, bureaucracy. One of the things that I'm afraid I rather accuse managerialists of bringing in. So I imagine that the reason that bureaucracy has expanded so much, in my view, is that we've had so many non-experts managing experts that they impose bureaucratic metrics and structures in to control them and understand them. Just to give you an example, you're a journalist, you've got a new boss, hasn't come from journalism, you're off on a job for 3 days, new boss thinks, is this person sunning themselves in Spain? What are they doing? Because there's no trust, they can't empathize, they can't put themselves in their shoes. So they impose bureaucracy on them. I want you to phone in to tick this box every 2 hours so that I know where you are. Now, someone who understands them wouldn't have that bureaucracy. So low bureaucracy, very low bureaucracy. I think bureaucracy in many, particularly the public sector, has become a nightmare. And this has been a big disincentive to why social workers don't want to get involved. Teachers are struggling terribly. Healthcare professionals in many countries, bureaucracy. And I believe that that's been imposed on them. I believe that when experts run things themselves, there's greater trust in the system, more fluidity in the system, and there's likely to be less bureaucracy. Flexibility, again, we've had an issue, I think, with inflexible organizations, and something needs to be changed. People are in jobs, particularly again, in many of the sort of public sectors or the not-for-profit sectors, we're not as flexible as we should be. If something has lost its sell-by date, we should be prepared to change that immediately. And that doesn't mean just sack everyone. It just means we need to reconfigure things much more quickly than we have. Now, in some ways, we have moved quickly. In other ways, I feel we haven't. But I think flexibility is really important. I think allowing dissent, we've become so politically correct in a way that people can't say what they feel. I mean, speakers can't even go to university and express themselves without being stopped. So I think we need empathic dissent. I mean, people need to be able to say in teams, for me, the great thing about teams is you should be able to be in a safe space and be able to disagree with each other, and quite strongly if necessary. And I think a lot of that has gone. And the other side of that is when there's staff who are really misbehaving. We've all witnessed this so often in organizations where staff are just allowed to misbehave or they're moved around somewhere else. We need to deal with that. We need to have what they used to have in the kind of Florence Nightingale idea of a hospital, for example. Bosses were responsible. They had to take that responsibility. They had to sort out bad people who are misbehaving, etc., and not allow bad behavior to spread or to isolate so many people. And that's another thing I think that an expert-friendly organization has, is that people should take responsibility in leadership. And I think that that's easier to some extent in expert-led organizations. I don't know that that's necessarily always the case, but I think that that's an important part. And importantly, the expertise should be running through the head of the organization, the board. We need experts on boards. In many settings, there's boards that are full of people who really don't understand the core business of the organization at all. And I think that's a massive problem. Yeah, that's an extraordinary problem. So we need them right from the boards all the way through the organization, in line management positions as well. Finally, I mean, we talk about flexibility. I think one of the big things in the degree that I run for doctors, the first module we have is we hold a mirror up to them. And this degree is only for doctors. And the reason we made it a doctor-only degree, where I got a lot of flack for that, again, from the political correct lobby, there's a kind of attitude which is anyone can be a leader that's sort of permeated the world. And I don't believe that's true, actually. But we created this space for doctors so that they could really critique themselves without having, managers or nurses or other players in. And by the way, nurses have been doing this for 30 years. And the first module is holding this mirror up to them so that we can help them reflect it gets very intense and emotional. We look at emotional intelligence. We look at, having difficult conversations, all this kind of stuff, narcissistic behaviors, et cetera, And that I think is really important, is you have to constantly learn. You have to constantly be open. And it goes back to where you started me off, actually, which is this idea of humility. To have humility, it means that you are constantly open to learning about yourself. And this can be a problem with experts, right? They can be hubristic. They think, well, I've made it in this. I'm a brilliant property developer. I'm thinking of one particular person, but that means I can do anything. And that's not the case at all. So we need humility. We need to hold that mirror up constantly. And I think that's absolutely important. I think real organizations, I would say great leaders, going back to where we started, in expert-friendly organizations, would have that, again, cascade through the organization, that we all have to challenge ourselves, challenge each other, and allow that kind of tension in there. I think that's what's gone. I think that a lot of the reason why performance in the UK has declined is I believe that experts have just been jettisoned, apart from the fact that it was a non-expert that, in Liz Truss, who decided that she was going to change the tax system in a way that all experts said, don't do it. And now we're paying for that. But I do think performance has dropped largely because expertise has been downgraded in the UK, I think more than in Europe, actually. And second, because I think when things go wrong, they're not being challenged. I think we just don't challenge each other enough. We don't challenge ourselves maybe enough. We don't challenge each other enough, actually. We've become too focused on that I am important rather than how do I relate to others. That's what's really important in my mind, is how we as individuals relate to others, and trying to keep our minds open to that. And that's challenging for us all. It's really difficult for us all. Does that touch on some of them anyway? It's not everything that's in that chapter, but
of course not. And of course, we should all be going out and buying your book, which is the purpose of the book, and reading it and thinking about it. But what I love in that answer is that you've really given us two very important things to conclude on, which are humility and being willing to have a mirror held up. And I think if anybody listening to this takes only those two ideas away, then they will be fundamentally better for the listening. So Amanda, thank you for joining me and getting into this conversation that's so important. I very much do hope that the listeners will feel inspired to go out and buy your book and to follow your work, because it's fascinating. Thank you so much for being with me.
You're very kind. Thank you, Claire, for having me on.
We hope you enjoyed hearing from this month's guest as much as we did.
Do go and check out our work on disrupt-your-career.com and come back soon. Thank you.